hello, everybody. As you know, the ongoing COVID-19 public health emergency has impacted aviation heavily. And business aviation, unfortunately, is not immune from the disruption and the uncertainty. So insofar as operations are able to go ahead, those responsible for aircraft, crew, and passengers now face complex risk management questions relating to all sorts of medical and security concerns. And MedAire is a company that's long provided expertise and support to the business aviation sector on these issues. I'm joined today by MedAire's Security Director, John Cauthen, who, as it happens, is also a member of NBAA's Security Council. So first of all, John, from your perspective, what are you seeing among MedAire's customers, and to what extent are their aircraft able to operate today given all the travel restrictions and the constraints? And to what extent is the nature of these operations different from how it might have been? Those who are flying, are they flying different types of operation?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. First and foremost, appreciate your time and very good to talk to you again. Mm-hmm. So, as you noted, the environment is quite different than it was just a few months ago. And we are seeing a fairly significant drop-off in flights in general. And of course, this has impacted business aviation just as it has commercial aviation. Not unheard of to see completely idle operations, for example, where previously they might have been operating at capacity or even slightly above capacity. This is affecting anyone from corporate flights to charter flights. We did see a slight uptick in some of the repatriation operations very early on as countries began to mobilize some of their restrictions and their prohibitions to repatriate some of those national citizens back into their home country. But it has tapered off a bit. There are some charter flights that are still going out, of course, but the environment in total that we're seeing is quite restrictive. So that's actually created a problem globally for aircraft to be out and about operating. So in general, that's fundamentally what we've seen.
Fair enough. Now, of course, all of us now are so much more aware than we ever were about measures like social distancing in our everyday lives. But how does any of that apply in an operational situation for people flying aircraft? And what sort of other medical considerations do operators have to keep in mind as they try to at least operate some flights?
Yeah, absolutely. And MedAire, as you know, is both a medical and a security company. And we've had our medical professionals, our doctors, our aerospace, aeromedical personnel really involved in this process. And they're really the experts to have this conversation. But what I can tell you is, first and foremost, I would recommend having that discussion with a medical professional, whether it's MedAire or not, ensuring that you're getting the most up-to-date, valid, and pertinent advice as this evolves in a medical sense. But some of the things, as you note, because aircraft are fairly contained systems by nature, pilots up front, aircrew in the back, passengers, they're going to be in fairly close proximity. Some of the things that we're seeing and we are discussing with clients and others, make sure that you are understanding what that contact history is. What that means is, who have you had contact with in the last few days? Are there issues that you should be aware of, and how might that impact your operations? There's also been some discussion about thermal testing, meaning can you use a thermal scanner to at least try and understand if this person is exhibiting potential symptoms that might be associated with COVID-19. These are some things that are being implemented in some areas. And then, of course, just in the aircraft itself, if you are being in a crew kind of concept and you've been working with the same personnel and essentially you've been isolating together, that can bring in some sense of comfort, if you will, in this sort of process. And of course, aircraft themselves, they also have very, very good filtration systems, HEPA filters, so on and so forth, and a number of operators, whether they're corporate, charter, fractional, whatever the case may be, they've really doubled down, if you will, on their cleaning procedures. So these are some of the things, and I've only touched on them slightly, that are being used from a mitigation standpoint to address this issue. But really, for any of the really medical questions, those really should be addressed by a medical professional. And again, whether it's through MedAire or another provider, There are a number of folks that are talking about this. And of course, there are various other areas where you can access this type of information, whether it's the World Health Organization, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and MedAire and International SOS, of course, have an abundance of information posted up online that will talk to these very issues.
Yeah, good point. Now, beyond the medical considerations, of course, when you fly around the world, there are always security issues that you have to consider, rules and regulations. But given the complexity of today's situation, where it seems that the additional travel restrictions from COVID-19 can shift almost day to day in some parts of the world, how do operators ensure that they're on the right side of those requirements, on the right side of the law? And are there any particular security concerns at this time that operators have to be even more mindful of if they're still trying to fly?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Charles. And what we're seeing at MedAire is an ever-shifting landscape. And people have been hearing, and it's a well-worn statement, that this is dynamic, it's ever-evolving, it's quickly evolving, so on and so forth. And that's certainly true as far as the restrictions. We saw that there was a slow uptick, if you will, in countries implementing this. There were some concerns about what impact that would have societally, as well as on the economy. But globally speaking, we've seen essentially blanket restrictions. These started off somewhat tepidly, if you will, and they've been extended and extended and extended in some circumstances, in some locations out to the end of April, even into the beginning of May. So what that means for any operator is if you're considering going into a particular location, you have to be prepared to do your due diligence and know exactly what you're going to be potentially flying into, because these restrictions and prohibitions can change on the drop of a hat. Mm-hmm. What you saw 24 hours ago might not necessarily be applicable 12 hours later, 24 hours later, 36 hours later. So what we would recommend is making sure internally you have systems and processes in place to ensure that you are making all efforts to understand what those rules and restrictions are. And it's not just necessarily the destination, but any overflight as part of your flight path. If you would have to divert because of a mechanical failure or some other issue, understand what those restrictions are in a particular country. We've even seen some locations where airspace has essentially been restricted to non-citizens of a location. So there is a wide variety. There is no standardization, if you will. Mm-hmm. So it's absolutely critical that you do all that due diligence. And MedAire is following this very closely. So certainly an organization that can help you in this capacity. As far as additional security concerns that you talked about, really, they're probably, if you will, related directly to COVID-19. As everybody's aware, this has had a significant and negative economic impact, and that economic impact is affecting countries quite differently. If you're in potentially a fragile location where some of the institutions, whether it's the economics or the societal institutions, and also the political nature of that location, if they're already fragile, COVID is certainly straining that further. And so what we're seeing in some locations, because of the deterioration in that circumstance being driven by the economic issues related to COVID, there's increases in opportunistic crime. We're seeing some instances of looting for basic goods. Services aren't being applied in the same way they would be under normal circumstances. And we're also seeing, to a certain degree, potential for increased xenophobic attacks. So there are some locations where if you are a traveler, if you are flying in, you may be perceived in a way that wouldn't have necessarily happened pre-COVID. And that's some of the issues that are associated with lack of understanding, or if I will, some of the issues around COVID and how that's impacting people's thought processes on this. So those are definitely some of the things to consider. And I'll close with saying that, as most people can probably assume, you're going to see continuous second and third order effects from a security standpoint. As those situations deteriorate, whether they're socioeconomic or political, there is a possibility for increased civil unrest, social strife, mass protests, and these can be exacerbated by some of the deprivations that are being driven by COVID-19, the restrictions, lockdown, shelter in place, whatever that terminology that's being used in a particular location. So definitely something to be concerned about if your crew is flying into a location and have the best information possible, do that deep risk assessment, and really understand what the issues are, both medically and security related.
Good point. And have a sort of backup plan to deal with anything, because it's some of those concerns you flagged up are concerns that have always been there. Others are sort of new to this situation. But the common factor, I suppose, is, make no safe assumptions about how things are going to go. Make sure you've got a plan A, B, and possibly C, I suppose, to deal with it.
Yeah, it's a great point. Contingency plans, backup plans, these are all extraordinarily important, and maybe even warrant a higher degree of focus in the current situation, just because of the uncertainty and also the changing nature of this. As we noted, something could change within 12 to 24 hours, and that could substantially impact your operation should you be flying to a particular location.
Good. Okay. Now, John, you said in an article you just wrote recently that, for those people who are either not flying as much or they're potentially grounded altogether, this challenging and frankly quite frustrating situation potentially provides an opportunity for people to review their operation, to take a hard look at how they do things and ask themselves, is this a good time to instigate some change? What did you mean by that? What sort of an opportunity is this for people?
Yeah, it's something that I think some operators are certainly doing right now. Maybe others are getting geared up and prepared to do so. But given some of this downtime, if your operations, for example, are completely idle, what are those things that you should be thinking about to prepare for the future? Because inevitably, aviation operations are going to return in some capacity. The big question, of course, looming out there is when. I don't think anybody with any certainty can answer that question, but we do know it is going to come back. What will be the nature of that return to flight operations? That's also another question. But fundamentally, right now, as we do sit idle in some way, whether it's 100% or partially or whatever the case may be, it's a perfect opportunity to really sit back, as I noted in the article, reflect, take a moment to understand what are some of those things that you need to do to not only improve your operations in general. Maybe there was deferred reviews of procedures, manuals, processes, your emergency response plan that was applicable prior to COVID-19, for example. Maybe that needs to be reviewed and updated to account for a pandemic-like situation that may very well return in the future. There may be a second wave, as we've heard from medical professionals, for example. So how do you account for that type of stuff? This is a perfect opportunity if you're sitting idle to take advantage of that downtime, so to speak, and actually take a moment, reflect, think on the things that have been deferred, because we were so busy previously focusing on flight operations. Everybody was running, flying. Now sit back for a moment, think about what you can do to improve those operations to get yourself set up for the future. And this would be, again, of course, as I noted, a time to review all of those publications, whatever they might be, any processes that you have in place, security or otherwise. How do you link potentially to a larger part of the organization, whether it's corporate headquarters or a parent company or whatever the case may be? And how does your emergency operations, your crisis planning, your personnel link with some of those other entities that are addressing similar issues, but not necessarily in an aviation context? And then, of course, prepare for the inevitable return to flight operations, whatever that might look like. So that's essentially what I was getting at, to the heart of that. It is really an opportune time to do that and really set yourself up for the inevitable return to those flight operations.
Good. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's really a mixture of taking good care of an operation insofar as it is still operating, but also not sitting around getting frustrated because you can't fly. Use that time that you've promised yourself for years and never taken to actually, take a constructive look at what you're doing and possibly make some change.
Yeah, exactly that. And we are seeing operators, from a maintenance standpoint, aircraft are not going to necessarily sit idle. You can do you still have to do certain levels of maintenance. These aircraft have to go to their MROs. You can prep the aircraft in that capacity. And also, frankly, aircraft shouldn't sit idle and not operate. So we know that folks are running and turning those aircraft to a certain degree. Now, whether they're flying them in their operational capacity is another matter. But these are absolutely some of the things that are taking place. But I would also argue that it's a great time to sit back and think about some of those processes that are absolutely integral to any aviation operation, whether it's, again, like I noted, reviewing your ERP, taking a hard look at your SMS. What are some of the things that need to be integrated into it so you can be as prepared as possible for the return flight operations?
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you, John. It's very good to catch up with you again, and we do appreciate your time. Thanks for sharing that with us, and maybe we can talk to you again sometime as things develop.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Charles. Really appreciate it, to you and the folks at AIN.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this AIN video. Please like, subscribe, and share it if you've enjoyed it. Also, visit AINonline.com for all the latest on the aviation industry.